Hey, what is going on, y'all? Welcome to MimiLeaks. I'm continuing this document today, the USA versus Donald Trump, government's motion for immunity determinations. And last time I wrapped up just as we got into the allegations about the former president and his co-conspirators and their attempt to overturn the 2020 presidential election results in Arizona specifically is where I ended last time. Today, I will pick up at Georgia as we read through what the prosecution argues were efforts in altering electors in targeted states. But first, please like this video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell if you wish to stay informed on when new videos are released. And so here we go. All right, that leaves us next with Georgia. So, 2. Georgia. The defendant had early notice that his claims of election fraud in Georgia were false. Around mid-November, campaign advisor P4 told the defendant that his claim that a large number of dead people had voted in Georgia was false. The defendant continued to press the claim anyway, including at a press appearance on November 29, when he suggested that a large number of dead voters had cast ballots to change the outcome of the election in Georgia. 4 days later, on December 3rd, CC1 orchestrated a presentation to a judiciary subcommittee of the Georgia State Senate. In the early morning in advance of it, CC1 had spoken to the defendant on the phone for almost 20 minutes. At that hearing, CC1 arranged for co-conspirators and agents to repeat the false dead voter claim. The claim was so patently false that everyone around the defendant knew it. During the hearing, Chief of Staff P21 and P9 exchanged text messages on their personal phones, confirming that a campaign attorney, P22, had verified that CC1's claim of more than 10,000 dead voters was false, and that the actual number was 12 and could not be outcome determinative. During the subcommittee hearing, the conspirators also set in motion a sensational and dangerous lie about the election workers at State Farm Arena that would result in the defendant's supporters harassing and threatening these workers. First, P23 told one of the defendant's private attorneys the claim that more than 10,000 dead people had voted in Georgia. Next, P24, an agent for the defendant, and it might be a redacted also an agent, not sure. P24, redacted, an agent of the defendant, played misleading excerpts of closed-circuit camera footage from State Farm Arena and insinuated that it showed election workers committing misconduct, counting suitcases of illegal ballots. Lastly, based on the false fraud allegations, CC2, who had already been engaged as a private lawyer for the defendant but did not disclose that at the hearing, encouraged the Georgia legislatures to decertify the state's legitimate electors. While the hearing was ongoing, the defendant simultaneously amplified the misinformation about the State Farm Arena election workers, falsely tweeting, quote, "Wow, blockbuster testimony taking place right now in Georgia. Ballot stuffing by Dems when Republicans were forced to leave the large counting room. Plenty more coming, but this alone leads to an easy win of the state," unquote. He did this just after retweeting 2 of his campaign account's tweets that promoted the false claim about election workers at State Farm Arena. Over the next week, the claim of misconduct at State Farm Arena was disproven publicly as well as directly to the defendant. The day after the hearing, P25, the chief operating officer of the Georgia Secretary of State's office, posted a tweet explaining that the Secretary of State's officers had watched the video in its entirety and confirmed that it showed, quote, "normal ballot processing," unquote. P25 again forcefully debunked the conspirators' claim about the State Farm video in a press conference on December 7th, explaining at length the election workers' innocent conduct depicted in the closed-circuit camera footage and stating, quote, "And what's really frustrating is the president's attorneys had this same videotape. They saw the same exact things the rest of us could see, and they chose to mislead state senators and the public about what was on the video. I'm quite sure that they will not characterize the video if they try to enter it into evidence, because that's the kind of thing that could lead to sanctions, because it's obviously untrue. They knew it was untrue, and they continued to do things like this, unquote. On December 8th, the defendant called Georgia Attorney General P26. P26 had advance notice that the topic of the call was Texas versus Pennsylvania, an election lawsuit in which Texas was suing other states, including Georgia, to attempt to prevent the certification of the election. U.S. Senator P27 told P26 that the defendant had heard that P26 was whipping or lobbying other states' attorneys general against filing amicus briefs in support of Texas. P26 was not lobbying against the suit and told P27, so P27 asked P26 if he would speak with the defendant about it, and P26 agreed. Shortly thereafter, the defendant called P26 and immediately raised the Texas versus Pennsylvania case, saying, quote, "I hope you're not talking to your AGs and encouraging them not to get into the lawsuit," unquote. P26 told the defendant that he was not affirmatively calling the other state attorneys generals, but that if they did call him, he was telling them what he was seeing in his state, which was something that the defendant probably did not want to hear. P26 was just not seeing evidence of fraud in Georgia. The defendant nonetheless raised various fraud claims. P26 told him that state authorities had investigated the State Farm Arena allegations and found no wrongdoing, and that he thought another claim of the defendant's raised about Coffee County, Georgia, had been simply resolved, but would check. The defendant asked P26 to look at them again, quote, "because we're running out of time," unquote. P26 tried to steer the call to an end by thanking the defendant and telling him that he had voted for him twice and appreciated the defendant, to which the defendant replied, quote, "Yeah, I did a hell of a job, didn't I?" unquote. At one point, the defendant raised with P26 the impending runoff election for Georgia's U.S. Senate seats and how important it was to re-elect P27 and P28. The day after the call, the defendant, in his private capacity as a candidate for president, intervened in support of Texas versus Pennsylvania. His attorney, for that matter, was CC2. On that same day, as the defendant's call with P26, the defendant's campaign staff acknowledged that the State Farm Arena claim was unsupported, emailing one another, in fact, that television networks may decline to run campaign advertisements promoting it. In frustration regarding the claim and others like it, P4, who spoke with the defendant on a daily basis and had informed him on multiple occasions that various fraud claims were false, wrote, quote, "When our research and campaign legal team can't back up any of the claims made by our elite strike force legal team, you can see why we're 0 to 32 on our cases. I'll obviously hustle to help on all fronts, but it's tough to own any of this when it's all just conspiracy shit beamed down from the mothership," unquote. On December 10th, however, CC1 further perpetuated the false State Farm Arena claim when he appeared at another hearing, this one before the Georgia House of Representatives Government Affairs Committee. During it, he played some of the footage that he had seen and had been used in the December 3rd hearing that had been debunked in the interim by the Georgia officials, and nonetheless claimed that it showed, quote, "voter fraud right in front of people's eyes," unquote. He then named 2 election workers, P29 and her mother, P30, and baselessly accused them of, quote, "quite obviously, surreptitiously passing around USB ports as if they are vials of H or C medicine, substance," unquote, and suggested that they were criminals whose, quote, "places of work, their homes, should have been searched for evidence of ballots, for evidence of USB ports, for evidence of voter fraud," unquote. As these false claims about P30 and P29 spread, the women were barraged by racist death threats. In the years since, they have spoken about the effect of the defendant and co-conspirators' lies about them, As P30 explained in an interview with congressional investigators, quote, when someone as powerful as the defendant, as the President of the United States, eggs on a mob, that mob will come. They come for us with their cruelty, their threats, their racism, and their hats. They haven't stopped even today, unquote. Indeed, to this day, the defendant has never stopped falsely attacking P30 and P29. Although none of the false claims against them were ever corroborated, the defendant has continued to levy them on social media, including when the defendant attacked P30 on January 2023, just after her testimony to congressional investigators was made public. Throughout the post-election period, the defendant used Twitter to publicly attack Georgia Governor P17 with particular aggression. In the 35 days between November 30th, 2020 and January 3rd, 2021, the defendant tweeted critically about P17 by name or title more than 40 times. These tweets included the ones also attacking P16 described above, as well as others particular to P17, like, quote, why won't Governor at P17, the hapless governor of Georgia, uses emergency powers, which can be easily done, to overrule his obstinate Secretary of State and do a match of signatures on envelopes? It will be a gold mine of fraud, and we will easily win the state, unquote. Also, quote, I will easily and quickly win Georgia if Georgia Governor P17 or the Secretary of State permit a simple signature verification. Has not been done and will show large-scale discrepancies. Why are these two Republicans saying no? If we win Georgia, everything falls in place, unquote. Also, quote, the Republican governor of Georgia refuses to do signature verification, which would give us an easy win. What's wrong with this guy? And what is he hiding? Unquote. And, quote, how does Governor at P17 allow certification of votes without verifying signatures and despite the recently released tape of ballots being stuffed? His poll numbers must have dropped like a rock. He's finished as governor, unquote. In the post-election period, the defendant also made false claims in court about fraud in Georgia unsuccessfully. For example, Trump versus Kemp, a federal lawsuit in which the defendant sued Georgia's governor and Secretary of State, the defendant signed a verification of fraud allegations that he and his attorney on the case, CC2, knew was inaccurate. P9 spoke with the defendant and CC2 in late December regarding the proposed verification. First, he told CC2 and another private attorney, P31, that they could not have had the defendant sign it because they could not verify any of the facts. And P9 told defendant that any lawyer that signed the complaint of the verification supported would get disbarred. 7. Voting machines in multiple states. Throughout the post-election period, the defendant and co-conspirators repeatedly made claims about the security and accuracy of voting machines across multiple states, despite the fact that they were on notice that the claims were false. As early as November 12th, for instance, the National Association of Secretaries of State, the National Association of State Election Directors, and other coordinated federal, state, and private entities issued a public statement declaring that the 2020 election was, quote, the most secure in American history, unquote, and that there was, quote, no evidence that any voting machine system deleted or lost votes, changed votes, or in any way was compromised, unquote. On November 14th, in the tweet announcing that CC1 was to lead his campaign legal efforts, the defendant also named CC3, a private attorney who was fixated on voting machine claims, and P10, another private attorney. 2 days later, on November 16th, on the defendant's behalf, Executive Assistant P42 sent CC3 and other private attorneys an email titled From POTUS, attaching a document containing bullet points critical of C3, a company that manufactured voting machines used in certain states, and writing, quote, See attached. Please include as is or almost as is in lawsuit, unquote. CC3 responded 9 minutes later in writing. Oh, this is in all quotes. Quote, "It must go on all suits in Georgia and Pennsylvania immediately with a fraud claim that requires the entire election to be set aside in those states and machines impounded for nonpartisan professional inspection," unquote. On November 17, P50, the director of the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, publicly tweeted that a group of private election security experts concluded that claims of computer-based election fraud, quote, either have been unsubstantiated or are technically incoherent, unquote. 2 days later, on November 19th, CC1, CC3, P10, and others held a press conference at the RNC headquarters on behalf of the defendant and his campaign. During it, CC3 made false and factually impossible claims regarding C3 and the integrity of the country's election infrastructure. That night, Fox News television personality, P51, stated on air that because of CC3's incendiary comments about voting machines, he had invited her on the television program. He further stated, quote, "But she never sent us any evidence despite a lot of requests, polite requests, not a page. When we kept pressing, she got angry and told us to stop contacting her. When we checked with others around the Trump campaign, people in positions of authority, they told us CC3 has never given them any evidence either. She never demonstrated that a single actual vote was moved illegitimately by software from one candidate to another, not one," unquote. The defendant saw his private attorney's RNC press conference and P51's discussion of CC3, and he acknowledged to P4 that CC3 had appeared unhinged in the press conference. On November 20th, the day after the press conference, the defendant made a similar comment to P7 and P45, two White House staffers who also volunteered for his campaign. In casual conversation, after another meeting had ended, the defendant told P7 and P45 that P51 had eviscerated or destroyed CC3. The defendant then had a call with CC3 on speakerphone while P7 and P45 listened in and mentioned the P51 segment to CC3. While CC3 responded, the defendant placed the call on mute and to P7 and P45 mocked and laughed at CC3, called her claims crazy, and made reference to the science fiction series Star Trek while describing her allegations. In the same time period, when P9 told the defendant that CC3's claims were unreliable and should not be used in lawsuits, the defendant agreed that he had not seen anything to substantiate CC3's allegations. On November 22nd, notwithstanding the defendant's tweet from 8 days prior announcing CC3's involvement, CC1 issued a statement on behalf of the campaign, distancing the defendant from CC3. CC3 is practicing law on her own. She is not a member of the Trump legal team. She also is not a lawyer for the president in his personal capacity." And that was a quote. Nonetheless, the defendant continued to support and publicize CC3's knowingly false claims. For example, within days of CC1's statement, the defendant promoted a lawsuit that CC3 was about to file, tweeting on November 24th, quote, "Breaking news!" at CC3 says her lawsuit in Georgia could be filed as soon as tomorrow and says there's no way there was anything but widespread election fraud. Hashtag MAGA, hashtag America First, hashtag Dobbs, unquote. CC3 filed a lawsuit the next day against the governor of Georgia, falsely alleging massive election fraud accomplished through C3's election software and hardware. The defendant again promoted the lawsuit in a tweet. The lawsuit was dismissed within 2 weeks on December 7th. On November 29th, P50, who was no longer the CISA director, appeared on the television program 60 Minutes. P50 stated that he was confident that the election had been secure and, quote, that there was no manipulation of the vote on the vote machine count side, unquote. In response, the defendant tweeted publicly about P50's appearance. Quote, "At 60 Minutes never asked us for a comment about their ridiculous, one-sided story on election security, which is an international joke. Our 2020 election, from poorly rated C3 to a country flooded with unaccounted for mail-in ballots, was probably our least secure ever," unquote. A few days later, P10 appeared on a radio program as the defendant's agent and said that because of P50's comments to promote confidence in the security of the election interference, P50, quote, "should be drawn and quartered, taken out and at dawn and shot," unquote. Thereafter, P50 was subjected to death threats. In a press conference on December 1st that the defendant acknowledged watching, P25, a Georgia election official, decried P10 and the defendant's public statements spreading disinformation and said that if they did not stop, quote, "someone is going to get killed," unquote. On November 1st, Attorney General P52 stated publicly that the Justice Department had not seen evidence of fraud sufficient to change the election results. With respect to voting machines, he said, "There's been one assertion that would be systemic fraud, and that would be that the claims the machines were programmed essentially to skew the election results. And the DHS and DOJ have looked into that, and so far, we haven't seen anything to substantiate that," unquote. CC1 and P12 immediately issued a formal campaign statement attacking P52 and the Justice Department, writing, quote, "With all due respect to the Attorney General, there hasn't been any semblance of a Department of Justice investigation. His opinion appears to be without any knowledge or investigation of the substantial irregularities and evidence of systemic fraud," unquote. In mid-December, the defendant spoke with RNC chairwoman P39 and asked her to publicize and promote a private report that had been released on December 13th that had purported to identify flaws in the use of C3 machines in Antrim County, Michigan. P39 refused, telling the defendant that she had already discussed the report with P38's Michigan Speaker of the House, who had told her the report was inaccurate. P39 conveyed to the defendant, P38, their exact assessment. The report was, quote, "fucking nuts," unquote. On January 2nd, during the defendant's call with Georgia's Secretary of State, P33 said of false claims regarding voting machines, quote, "I don't believe that you're really questioning the C3 machines, because we did a hand retally, a 100% retally of all the ballots, and compared to them to what the machine said, and came up with virtually the same result. Then we did a recount. We got virtually the same result. So I guess we could probably take that off the table," unquote. In response, the defendant falsely claimed that, quote, "in other states, we think we found tremendous corruption with C3 machines, but we'll have to see," unquote. At the Ellipse on January 6th, the defendant and co-conspirators who spoke at the rally continued to make unsubstantiated and false claims about C3 machines. CC1 claimed that in the U.S. Senate runoff election in Georgia the day before, quote, "the votes were deliberately changed by the same algorithm that was used in cheating President Trump and Vice President Pence," unquote. CC2 continued the false attack, quote, "We now know, because we caught it live last time in real time, how the machines contributed to that fraud. They put those ballots in a secret folder in the machines sitting there waiting until they know how many they need. And then the machines, after the close of polls, we now know who voted. And we know who hasn't. And I can now, in that machine, match those unvoted ballots with an unvoted voter and put them together in that machine. We saw it happen in real time last night. And it happened on November 3rd as well," unquote. In his own speech, the defendant again raised the false specter of, quote, "the highly troubling matter of C3 machines," unquote, and lied about machines flipping votes from the defendant to Biden and an astronomical and astounding, in his words, error rate in the machine's ballot scanning. 4. Nevada. On November 17, in Law v. Whitmer, agents of the defendant in Nevada filed suit claiming substantial irregularities, improprieties, and fraud in the presidential election, including based on machines used in ballot signature matching and votes by non-residents and dead voters. The defendant approved a press conference by his surrogates announcing the suit. On November 19th, P43, the RNC chief counsel, sent an email to P44, an RNC spokesperson, warning about inaccuracies in the suit. Quote, "Just FYI that I don't believe the claims in the contest regarding dead voters, those voting from out of state, etc., are substantiated. We are working with the campaign on data matching projection probably, and those numbers are going to be a lot lower than what the Nevada people have come up with. They're also targeting our military voters. To be frank, the contest has little chance of succeeding. Happy to discuss this stuff if you want more info." Unquote. P44 then sent a copy of P43's email from her personal email account to the personal email account of P45, one of the defendant's White House staffers who also volunteered for the campaign. Notwithstanding the RNC chief counsel's warning, the defendant retweeted and amplified news of the lawsuit on November 24th, calling it big news that a Nevada court had agreed to hear it. But the defendant did not similarly promote the fact that within 2 weeks, on December 4th, the Nevada District Court dismissed Law v. Whitmer, finding a detailed opinion that, quote, "There is no credible or reliable evidence that the 2020 general election in Nevada was affected by fraud," unquote, including through the signature match machines, and that Biden won the election in the state. 4 days later, on December 8th, Nevada's Supreme Court unanimously affirmed the district court's decision, noting that despite its, quote, "earlier order asking appellants to identify the specific findings in which they take issue, appellants have not pointed to any unsupported factual findings, and we have identified none," unquote. Sorry, you guys. My tongue is getting twist-tied. Okay. Later, in his ellipse speech on January 6th, the defendant repeated multiple claims explicitly rejected by Nevada courts. On December 18th, the Nevada Secretary of State office released a facts versus myth document to combat disinformation that the defendant and others were propagating about the election, including false claims that the Secretary of State's office had not investigated claims of fraud, even though it had been presented with evidence of widespread fraud, to which the office responded, quote, "While we are pursuing action in a number of isolated cases, we have yet to see any evidence of widespread fraud," unquote. The Facts versus Myths document also publicly stated that the courts had universally rejected fraud claims. Quote, 4 separate cases were heard by Nevada judges, including the Nevada Supreme Court. After examining records presented, each case was discounted due to a lack of evidence, unquote. 5. Pennsylvania. 2 days after the election, on November 6th, the defendant called P46, the chairman of the Pennsylvania Republican Party, the entity responsible for supporting Republican candidates in the Commonwealth at the federal, state, and local level. P46 had a prior relationship with the defendant, including having represented in litigation in Pennsylvania after the 2016 presidential election. The defendant asked P46 how, without fraud, had he gone from winning Pennsylvania on Election Day to trailing in the days afterwards. Consistent with what campaign staff had already told the defendant, P46 confirmed that it was not fraud, that there was roughly 1,750,000 mail-in ballots still being counted in Pennsylvania, which were expected to be 80% for Biden. Over the next few months, following 2 months specifically, the defendant spread false claims of fraud in Pennsylvania anyway. In early November, in a campaign meeting, when the defendant suggested that there were more people in Pennsylvania that voted than had checked in to vote, Deputy Campaign Manager P3 corrected him. Around the same time, Philadelphia City Commissioner P47 appeared on television and stated that there was no evidence of widespread fraud in Philadelphia. After seeing the interview, the defendant targeted P47, tweeting, quote, "A guy named P47, a Philadelphia commissioner and a so-called Republican rhino, is being used big time by the fake news media to explain how honest things were with respect to the election in Philadelphia. He refuses to look at a mountain of corruption and dishonesty. We win!" Unquote. As a result of the defendant's attacks, threats that P47 already was receiving became more targeted and detailed and included his address and the names of his family members. On the defendant's behalf, CC12 spread patently false claims about Pennsylvania. On November 25th, CC1 and P12 attended an unofficial meeting with Republican state legislators in a Gettysburg Hotel conference room. The defendant called in, claimed to have been watching, and demanded that the election in Pennsylvania has to be turned around. During the event, CC1 falsely stated that Pennsylvania issued 1.8 million absentee ballots and received 2.5 million in return. The claim was rooted in obvious error. The comparison of the number of ballots sent out in the primary election to the number of ballots received in the general election. After seeing CC1 make the claim, P43, the RNC's chief counsel, tweeted publicly, quote, "This is not true," unquote. In the following days, the campaign staff internally confirmed that CC1 was lying. When one campaign staffer wrote in an email that CC1 and the claim was just wrong and that there was no way to defend it, P3 responded, quote, "We have been saying this for a while. It's very frustrating," unquote. Likewise, in late November or December, P9 informed the defendant directly that a claim CC1 was spreading, that Pennsylvania had received 700,000 more mail-in ballots than were mailed out, was, quote, "bullshit," unquote, and explained the error. P43 followed up on his public tweet in a private email on November 28 to P44, the RNC spokesperson, expressing his concern about CC1 and P12's spread of disinformation. Quote, "I'm really not trying to give you a hard time, but what CC1 and P12 are doing is a joke, and they are getting laughed out of court. It is setting us back in our fight for election integrity, and they're misleading millions of people who have wishful thinking that the president is going to somehow win this thing." When CC1 learned of P43 and their tweet and email, on November 28th, he called P43 and left a threatening voicemail stating, quote, "I really do need an explanation for what you said today, because if there's not a good one, you should resign. Got it? So call me, or I'll call the boss and get you to resign. Call me. It'll be better for you if you do," unquote. CC1 also contacted RNC chairwoman P39 to demand that P43 be fired, and thereafter P43 was relieved of his duties as RNC chief counsel. On December 3rd, 4 Republican leaders of the Pennsylvania legislature issued a public letter stating that the General Assembly lacked the authority to overturn the popular vote and appoint its own slate of electors, and that doing so would violate the state's election code and constitution. P48, an agent of the defendant who worked closely with CC1, issued a tweet showing the 4 legislatures' names and signatures and wrote, quote, "These are the 4 cowardice Pennsylvania legislatures that intend to allow the Democrat machine to hashtag steal the vote. Hashtag cowards, hashtag liars, hashtag traitors," unquote, while linking to the legislature's Twitter accounts. On Sunday, December 6th, at 12:56 a.m., from the White House residence, having just returned from a political rally in Valdosta, Georgia, the defendant retweeted and amplified P48's post. 6. Wisconsin. On November 29th, a recount that the defendant's campaign had petitioned and paid for confirmed that Biden had won in Wisconsin and increased the defendant's margin of defeat. On December 14th, the Wisconsin Supreme Court rejected the campaign's election lawsuit there. As a result, on December 21st, Wisconsin's governor signed a certificate of final determination, confirming the prior certificate of ascertainment that established Biden's electors as the valid electors for the state. In response, the defendant issued a series of tweets attacking P49, the Wisconsin Supreme Court justice, who had just written the majority opinion rejecting his campaign lawsuit and advocating that the Wisconsin legislature overturn the valid election results. Quote, "2 years ago, the great people of Wisconsin asked me to endorse a man named P49 for state Supreme Court justice when he was getting destroyed in the polls against a tough Democrat candidate who had no chance of losing. After my endorsement, P49 easily won. Wow. He just voted against me in a big court decision on voter fraud, of which there were much, despite many pages of dissent from 3 highly respected justices. One thing has nothing to do with another, but we ended up losing 4-3 in a really incorrect ruling. Great Republicans in Wisconsin should take these 3 strong decisions to their state legislature and overturn this ridiculous state election. We won in a landslide," unquote. After the defendant's tweet, the state marshals responsible for P49 and their safety arranged to provide P49 with additional police protection based on social media traffic and other threatening communications. CC2 acknowledged this problem in an email on December 31st to P32, lead counsel for the defendant as candidate in Trump versus Kemp, and another private attorney, writing that in the time since the defendant signed a previous verification in the case, he, quote, "had been made aware that some of the allegations and evidence proffered by the experts had been inaccurate," unquote, and that signing a new affirmation, quote, "with the knowledge and incorporation by reference would not be accurate," unquote. Nonetheless, on December 31st, the defendant signed the verification and CC2 caused it to be filed. On January 2nd, Georgia Secretary of State P33 appeared on Fox News and said that various rumors of election fraud were false, and the defendant had lost in Georgia. Quote, "Our office has been very busy with what I call the rumor whack-a-mole. Every day, a rumor will pop up, and then we whack it down. What we do is, we basically whack it down to the truth. And people can't handle the truth sometimes because they're very disappointed in the results, and I get that. I voted for President Trump also, but at the end of the day, we did everything we could. We did an audit of the race. President Trump still lost. Then we did a full recount. President Trump still lost. We had a safe, secure process." P33, like P17, had been on the receiving end of the defendant's tweets. These included, quote, "Why isn't the Georgia Secretary of State P33, a so-called Republican, allowing us to look at signatures on envelopes for verification? We will find tens of thousands of fraudulent and illegal votes," unquote. Another, quote, "Rhinos at P17, at P34, and Secretary of State P33 will be solely responsible for the potential loss of our 2 great senators from Georgia, at P27 and at P28. Won't call a special session or check for signature verification. People are angry." And, "Georgia, where is the signature verification approval? What do you have to lose? Must move quickly. At P17, at P34, at Georgia Secretary of State," unquote. Shortly after seeing the interview, the defendant set up a call with P33 to discuss his pending private lawsuit, Trump versus Kemp, in which P33 was named defendant. For this reason, P33 had hoped to avoid speaking with the defendant, but ultimately acquiesced because the defendant was persistent in seeking to set it up. Also, because of the pending lawsuit, P33 arranged for his general counsel, P35, to participate. Joining the defendant on the call were Chief of Staff P21 and 3 private attorneys, P32 and P36, counsel of record in Trump v. Kemp, and the attorneys whom CC2 had emailed about the defendant's false verification, and P31, whom P21 introduced on the call as someone, quote, who is not the attorney of record but has been involved, unquote. The defendant began the call with an animated monologue in which he argued that he had won the election in Georgia, saying, quote, okay, thank you very much, hello, at P33 and at P35 and everybody. We appreciate the time and the call. So we've spent a lot of time on this, and if we could just go over some numbers, I think it's pretty clear that we won. We won very substantially, Georgia, unquote. Throughout the call, the defendant continued to state that he had won and referenced Biden's margin of victory that he needed to overcome to prevail in the state, including by asserting that, quote, I just want to find 11,780 votes, unquote. He did not reference other elections on the ballot. After the defendant's opening salvo, P33 stated, quote, well, I listened to what the president has just said. President Trump, we've had several lawsuits, and we've had to respond in court to the lawsuits and the contentions. We don't agree that you have won, unquote. The defendant raised multiple false claims of election fraud, each of which P33 refuted in turn. When the defendant attacked P30 and called her a, quote, professional vote scammer and hustler, unquote, and mentioned her dozens of times throughout the call, P33 said, quote, you're talking about the State Farm video, and I think it's extremely unfortunate that CC1 or his people, they sliced and diced that video and took it out of context, unquote. He then offered the defendant a link to the video disproving the claim, to which the defendant responded, quote, I don't care about a link. I don't need it. I have a much P33. I have a much better link, unquote. When the defendant claimed that 5,000 dead people had voted in Georgia, P33 said, quote, well, Mr. President, the challenge you have is the data you have is wrong. The actual number were two. Two people that were dead and voted. So that's wrong. That was two, unquote. When the defendant claimed that thousands of out-of-state voters had cast ballots, P33 counsel, P35 responded, quote, we've been going through each of those as well. And those numbers that we got that Ms. P31 was just saying, they're not accurate, unquote. At one point, the defendant became frustrated after both P33 and P35 explained repeatedly that his claims had been investigated and were not true, and stated, quote, and you're gonna to find that they are, which is totally illegal. It's more illegal for you than it is for them because you know what they did and you're not reporting it. That's criminal. You know, that's a criminal offense. And you know, you can't let that happen. That's a big risk to you and to P35, your lawyer. That's a big risk, unquote. The call ended with P35 stating that he would coordinate with the lawyer representing P33 office in the private lawsuit and get together with P32 as agreed earlier in the call. The day after the call, on January 3rd, the defendant falsely tweeted, quote, I spoke to the Secretary of State P33 yesterday about Fulton County and voter fraud in Georgia. He was unwilling or unable to answer questions such as ballots under table scam, ballot destruction, out-of-state voters, dead voters, and more. He has no clue, unquote. P33 promptly responded in a tweet of his own. Quote, respectfully, Mr. Trump, what you're saying is not true. The truth will come out, unquote. 3. Michigan. On November 20, 3 days after Michigan's governor signed the certificate of ascertainment appointing Biden's electors based on the popular vote, the defendant met with P37 and P38, Michigan's Senate Majority Leader and Speaker of the House, at the Oval Office. The defendant initiated the meeting by asking RNC Chairwoman P39 to reach out to P38 and gauge his receptivity to a meeting. And the defendant also asked P39 to participate in the meeting, but P39 told him that she had consulted with her attorney and she could not be involved in a meeting with legislatures because it could be perceived as lobbying. After P39 made the first contact on November 18th, The defendant reached out to P37 and P38 to extend an invitation. That same day, he contacted P37 and P38. The defendant issued a false tweet, quote, "In Detroit, there are far more votes than people. Nothing can be done to cure that giant scam. I win Michigan," unquote. When the defendant called P37 and P38 to invite them to the White House, he did not provide the topic of the meeting, but he did ask about the allegations of fraud in the election in Michigan. The legislatures told him that they and the Michigan legislature were examining the allegations. Both P37 and P38 assumed that the defendant wanted to see them to discuss claims of election fraud, and they wanted to be firm that they had not seen the evidence that would change the outcome of the election. For this reason, and to avoid talking only about election fraud, they prepared materials to raise regarding COVID-19 and planned in advance to release a statement once the meeting was over that said the legislatures were unaware of information that would change the outcome of the election. Over the course of the meeting, the defendant dialed in both P39, despite her request not to participate, and CC1. P21 was present for some time, but not all of the meeting. After some small talk with the legislators in the Oval Office, the defendant raised various fraud claims, including that he had lost Michigan because of fraud or misconduct in Wayne County, where Detroit is located. P37 corrected the defendant and told him that he lost primarily because in two routinely Republican counties, the defendant had underperformed with educated females, and if he had received the same number of votes there was as the two winning local sheriffs, he likely would have won Michigan. P37 could tell by the defendant's body language that he was not happy to hear P37's assessment. Notably, the defendant only raised fraud claims to the extent that they affected the outcome in his own race, not those for other offices in Michigan. CC1's participation came after the legislatures assured the defendant that they were looking into fraud claims. The defendant dialed CC1 into the meeting and said, quote, "CC1, tell them what's going on," unquote. CC1 then launched into a fraud monologue. Finally, P37 interrupted and asked, quote, "So when are you going to file a lawsuit in Michigan?" unquote, a question that CC1 ignored and did not answer. Immediately after the meeting, P37 and P38 released a public statement in which they said that they had not, quote, "not yet been made aware of any information that would change the outcome of the election in Michigan," unquote. On November 21st, the defendant acknowledged P37 and P38's statement when he tweeted, quote, "This is true, but much different than reported by the media," unquote, and implicitly conceded that he had not yet provided evidence of fraud, yet when he added, quote, "We will show massive and unprecedented fraud," unquote. Days later, the defendant's campaign declined to request a statewide recount in Michigan, for which it would have to pay, unless the recount succeeded in changing the outcome of the election. Despite failing to establish any valid fraud claims, CC1 followed up with P37 and P38 and attempted to pressure them to use the Michigan legislature to overturn the valid election results. On December 4th, CC1 sent a message to P38 claiming that Georgia was poised to do so, based on CC1 and CC2's false advocacy there in the December 3rd hearing, and asked P38 for help. Quote, "Looks like Georgia may hold some factual hearings and change the certification under Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 of the Constitution. As CC2 explained, they don't just have the right to do it, but the obligation. Help me get this done in Michigan," unquote. On December 7th, CC1 attempted to send P37 a message, though failed because he typed the wrong number into his phone. Quote, "So I need you to pass a joint resolution from the Michigan legislature that says that the election is in dispute. There's an ongoing investigation by the legislature, and the electors sent by Governor Whitmer are not the official electors of the state of Michigan and do not fall within the safe harbor deadline of December 8 under Michigan law," unquote. Campaign operative P5 was involved in the drafting of this message with the assistance of 41 who was associated with the defendant's campaign efforts in Michigan. The following day, CC1 shared the draft with the defendant, sending it to his executive assistant, P42, by email. Those efforts failed. On December 14th, the day that duly appointed electors across the country met and cast their electoral votes, P37 and P38 issued public statements confirming that the defendant had lost Michigan and the legislature still had not received evidence of outcome determinative fraud in their state. P37's public statement included, quote, "We have not received evidence of fraud on a scale that would change the outcome of the election in Michigan," unquote. P38 stated in part, quote, "We've diligently examined these reports of fraud to the best of our ability. I fought hard for President Trump. Nobody wanted him to win more than me. I think he's done an incredible job. But I love our republic too. I can't fathom risking our norms, traditions, and institutions to pass a resolution retroactively changing the electors for Trump simply because some think there may have been enough widespread fraud to give him the win. That's unprecedented for good reason. And that's why there is not enough support in the House to cast a new slate of electors. I fear we'd lose the country forever. This truly would bring mutually assured destruction for every future election in regards to the Electoral College. And I can't stand for that. I won't." Unquote. On January 3rd, the defendant's campaign publicly posted P37's phone number and attempted to post P38, but erred by one digit, in a tweet urging, quote, "Contact Speaker P38 and Senate Majority Leader P37, unquote. P37 received 4,000 text messages in 2 hours, forcing him to get a new number. Okay, y'all, that's where I'll be ending things this time. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and please like the video if you enjoyed the content. And I'll see you next time.